Like most of you, I read the Bible every day in an effort to understand it completely. No two people completely agree on their interpretation, so understanding it clearly involves something more than just basic skills like reading comprehension. Sometimes passages are literal and sometimes they're metaphors. Sometimes it's easy because Jesus let us know when he was telling a parable and when he wasn't. But so much of it is context, and to understand the context, we must both understand the author as well as the creator. We can read historical documents that help explain the personality and intentions of the authors of the Bible, and it may be accurate and it may be not. But we can learn a lot about other people from their work. Why would it be any different for the Father? Well, we can, but we have to understand that he is so far beyond us in every respect. I'd used the phrase, not even in the same ballpark, but comparing him to points within this realm that he created wouldn't even scratch the surface of understanding just how omnipotent and complex he really is. Although we may struggle to understand even a hint of who he is intellectually, in fact it's futile, I think we can make observations about his creation and hopefully gain some understanding. There are 3 ways I can think of to understand him better. 1. Develop a relationship with him. 2. Read the Bible and apply those teachings to our life and understanding of the world. And 3. Learn about him from his work. We have this entire world around us, and I firmly believe that understanding what he created will help us understand him better. I grew up in a secular home, and like most of the world, my parents had tremendous faith in Satan's institutions and Scientism. I'd argue it takes more faith to believe those lies than it does to be a Christian. You have to not only reject the Word of God, but also science. When I first came to Christ in my 20s, I wished that I'd been born into a Christian home. How great would it be to have received all this education at a young age? But not me. I was such an idiot. I used to laugh at people who said evolution is false science until I researched it for myself. They may have gotten a head start on me, but I'm realizing now that they had just as much work to unlearn the lies taught by the church about the real meaning of biblical passages, so maybe it ends up just being a wash. Most of you are way smarter than me and found God through faith. I had to be bashed on the head over and over again with science until I found Jesus. And if that doesn't make sense, it will by the end of this video. I'm also hoping it'll help convince my atheist and agnostic friends that we have a creator, and that he is good, and that he is the one from the Bible. This video is going to be an exercise in theology. How do we get close to God without overstepping our bounds? I covered in my previous video how we're supposed to live according to the Father. He designed a world for us to experience a very specific existence. But what happens when we exploit that in an effort to grow closer to him? Is that the same thing as exploiting it for corrupt purposes? I've made a few conclusions I want to share. I feel like people get tunnel vision and focus on the Bible exclusively for their spiritual guidance. And while it's no question certainly our greatest guide, the written word, it doesn't encompass its full meaning without a little bit of context. For example, I'm sure it means much more to us as adults than it did as children. Life experience is necessary to understand it. And for this, I look not to only the world he created for us, but also what's beyond. In the little season, we are bombarded with knowledge. Most of it false, some of it real, but all of it designed to take us away from God. To fill our brains to capacity with garbage all day with school, TV, and social media. So we aren't able to fit anything even remotely relevant to our true existence into our brains. Just propaganda to further Satan's agenda. This is a tough one, so I'll break it down biblically for both sides of the argument. And if it's like any of the previous videos, somebody will leave a comment with a perfect passage for the topic that I have completely overlooked. Deuteronomy 29:29 tells us some knowledge is only for God, and that the rest of us should only know what he provides. This isn't really specific, but certainly lets us know there are things we shouldn't know. 1 Corinthians 13:12 tells us that we don't know anything of God or the world he created for us, but it doesn't forbid or say not to seek knowledge. And it helps confirm that he is incomprehensible to us intellectually, and this is very important for our purposes. 1 Corinthians 8:1 teaches us that knowledge can lead to isolation and pride, that it can stop us from spreading love. That isn't necessarily a knock against knowledge as much as becoming dependent on it or prideful because of it, like academics today or Pharisees of Jesus' time. Ecclesiastes 1:18 shows us that the pursuit of knowledge will bring us spiritual disappointment. I think this is referring to adhering to science strictly, but never developing our spiritual sides. Extra biblical texts also show us that certain specific knowledge is bad. For example, in 1 Enoch, we're taught that fallen angels wanted us to know about metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, and sorcery. So those are easy bits of knowledge and activities to avoid. But I put an asterisk next to those words. They were written after the flood, and the monoliths we see today prove that the pre-flood era was much more technologically advanced than today. Certainly, those alive in 3rd century BC when it was written would have no words to describe technologies of that time. We don't even understand them today. Ezra goes the other way and explains that the pursuit of understanding that which stretches outside of this world is beyond our capabilities because we're simply too stupid in this form. And it's true, just look how confused people get when you try to get them to understand a tesseract. And that's just one extra dimension. Irenaeus, an early church father and student of Polycarp, warned us about the Gnostics who believed that God was hiding information from us, so they sought to find it. Not unlike the elite today, and that's not a coincidence. I'll go more into that later. They were Satanists and sought this knowledge from the serpent, according to the Apocryphon of John. On the one hand, we were only given 5 senses, and even those 5 have very little capabilities to see the reality around us. So why wouldn't we be given the ability to see what instrumentation can detect? What science can tell us about the makeup of our world? Makes sense to me that it's because we are put here to live a certain way for the duration of our time in this realm. Further evidence to me that this is a test and convincing that we should live it in a manner according to the Creator's wishes. Daniel 12:4 tells us that we run to and fro, and knowledge is increased. I've talked about this before. Well, that describes our current situation perfectly. We are not living as the Father intended. We are living the fast-paced life of wage slaves, scurrying about just to make ends meet. That's the to and fro. And knowledge is increased. I used to think that was a reference to the internet and our ability to use it as a tool for education. But looking at it in context, it seems the opposite is true. This isn't describing knowledge in a good light. It's coupled with the to and fro, the rat race we currently endure. And a major component of that is the scientific discovery happening at the same time. We're diving too deep into learning about breaking out of our world, something the Father obviously didn't want us to do. Or he would have given us the senses to see it for ourselves in the first place. In Genesis, we are taught that we are to suffer because Eve allowed herself to be deceived by Satan, and that was eating the apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Of course, this is a metaphor. Adam and Eve decided they knew better than God and could navigate morality on their own. So they ate the apple, so to speak, and decided they were able to decide what was good and evil on their own. The serpent tricked them, but they ultimately decided their fate. This was not about knowledge of the world around us, though. It's about accepting his moral code. Science in and of itself isn't bad. In fact, in Genesis, the Father tells Adam to take dominion over all the plants and animals he created, to name and to classify them. And that's taxonomy, a branch of science. So we know the Father isn't opposed to all knowledge or the practice of science. Before Solomon turned to the dark side, he wrote Proverbs, which overwhelmingly promotes knowledge as a righteous characteristic. My favorites are 18:15, which says, "Wise people actively seek out knowledge," and 3:13 through 14, which tells us that knowledge and wisdom are as valuable as treasure. Job 28:28 and 12:22 show us that wisdom and knowledge take us closer to God. And he also showed himself to Job, which I'll talk about that later. Hosea 4:6 actually says too little knowledge is a problem. 2 Peter 1:5 says that knowledge is an essential virtue, just like faith. And of course, the rest of the New Testament tells us the importance of knowledge of Christ, which would make certain knowledge virtuous. Psalms 111:2 tells us that studying the Father's works, the things that he created, like mankind, animals, plants, the sky, the oceans, the heavens, everything we know in our universe to be studied by those who worship him. And those are all branches of science as well. Outside of the Bible, Clement of Alexandria, another early church father, said knowledge was the path to God. In Philippians 1:9 and 10, Paul argues that knowledge strengthens moral judgment. And I couldn't agree with him more, but many don't. Let me explain. Every so often in the comments, people tell me I'm depressing, and I shouldn't be bringing attention to the reality of the little season deception. That learning about how they enslave us or the symbology they use, and understanding their religion and worship practices will drive us away from the Father. The one part I do agree with is that we shouldn't participate in satanic practices, even when they're a routine part of daily life, which these same people actually disagree with, oddly enough. Or maybe it's not that odd at all, but to not be aware of evil around us doesn't make any sense to me. How can we avoid wickedness if we can't identify it? How can we tell good from evil if we don't know what evil is? Why did Jesus tell the apostles to be as wise as the serpent? And did he not also make us aware of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees? Satan is in control of the world today because almost everyone chooses to ignore the obvious wickedness around us. And truth be told, it's because they enjoy participating in it. Ignorance is bliss, and they want to enjoy the spoils of the little season without the guilt of knowing they're worshiping Satan. I'd argue ignoring it is advocating for it. I'd even take it a step further and ask, how are those who choose to be blind to wickedness in the world any different than the mother who turns a blind eye to the new stepfather who rapes her children? In both circumstances, they've ruined their children's lives. Being aware of what the wicked ones are up to isn't the same thing as casting spells or summoning demons. So how much are we supposed to know? Are we supposed to understand the world God created or just live in it as he created it? Are we here to figure out what this is, or are we here for an experience created for us? The theme here is that there's knowledge that we're supposed to know and knowledge that we aren't. Knowledge that confirms what God tells us in the Bible has to be great, especially when we use real science to confirm it's correct. Knowledge that tries to undermine God or live in a manner in which he didn't have in mind for us is bad. Jeremiah 9:23 and 24 sums it up best. The best knowledge in the world is knowing the Father himself. And we know that primarily means forging a spiritual relationship with him. But it can also mean doing our research, both in the Bible and what we can make of the true science that confirms it. We know right off the bat we live in a simulation because Genesis tells us that. It's amazing to me how many Christians claim we don't live in a simulation. By doing so, they're literally saying that God didn't create this. The Father created this world, this earth, and all the heavens. But for that to be true, he has to exist outside of these dimensions. Within them for sure, but also outside. Whether Christian or secular, it's one of the things confirmed by both science and the Bible. God created us in his image and placed us in this world he created specifically for us. That's the definition of a simulation. He created this realm. Creationism and simulation are the same thing. And this is the good simulation, the one the Father created. The secular notion is that the universe expanded out of nowhere from nothing. Then they say it was high-density matter and heat. They can't even get the fake science right. But even if that were true, it would be evidence of a creator. Something intelligent had to cause the Big Bang. Then they say we evolved from single-celled aquatic organisms and everything is just random coincidence. But it's so obvious we aren't incidentally here. The brainwashing it took to convince the general population that we evolved from single-celled organisms is astonishing. Under a microscope, it became quite apparent that even the simplest life forms are so complicated that they can't just magically appear. Now here's where it gets tricky because science confirms we live in a simulation, but scientism denies it. They lie about their own findings because it confirms a creator. When cornered, they say our God is actually aliens, anything to divert us from the truth.
What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet.
And that is the goal of Satan, demons, and his minions, to drive us away from Christ. The pursuit of science, especially with the elite trying to summon demons with the use of super colliders or various spiritual and chemical methods, breaking through the firmament like Operation Fishbowl, breaking us out of the simulation, yes, that's actually a thing, and finding the cure for aging in an effort to fight the will of God in many ways mirrors Babylon. And this is where the pursuit of science to grow closer to the Father becomes a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can seem like a noble endeavor. Learning about his creation is learning about him. But that can lead to pulling further and further away. Just look at the Gnostics and Hermetics. As I'm about to show, science proves the existence of God, but I'm not convinced he wanted us to explore much beyond that. Let me explain. So much of witchcraft, sorcery, technology, education, science, psychedelic drug use, etc., allow us to see that we are living in a simulation, which confirms and gives glory to the Father, but in some cases can allow us to communicate with demons and other entities outside of our realm. And I don't believe that's his intention. He wants us to experience the life that he prepared for us. But knowing he wants us to be knowledgeable means that he must love real science, which confirms his existence. The Bible only tells us so much, and I use every means necessary to try and understand God so as to understand his vision for this world. Science, or trying to understand this world that he created, is one of the few things we have outside of his written word. This is why technology is such a hot topic for me. I try to put myself in his shoes and have reached certain conclusions. And this is why I try to understand the universe that he created for us, because if we can understand the tools he used to create our reality, it might help us to understand his. Here are some of the biblical passages confirming multiple dimensions. The most obvious is Genesis. He created everything. The only way for that to be possible is if he exists outside of our 3 dimensions plus time. In our case, he also exists within it. Genesis books 18 and 19 show angels that appear out of nowhere, eat, and then vanish. Again, that sounds like they're able to slip between dimensions. Psalms 94 tells us that God is aware of our dimension but does not exist entirely within it. 2 Timothy 1:9 says time exists in a straight line for us. Grace was given before time, but for God all time and all potential timelines exist at once, which is consistent with higher dimensional beings, confirming our limited knowledge of this realm. Colossians 1:16 speaks of things that are visible and things that are invisible. We're given 5 senses that detect some of the things going on around us, but not most. Those things that are invisible are just as real as the visible stuff, but it's just human nature to reject things that we can't see or touch. Some of these things that we can detect with modern scientific equipment, some way more advanced than others. Sometimes we can see things beyond our mortal means with prayer, and sometimes with psychedelic substances. The only one of these I recommend would be prayer, and only to the one true Father. Titus 1:2 says God promised eternal life before time began, again confirming our understanding of space-time. Time is linear for us, but the Father experiences all events as singular. Dreaming and some psychedelics are about as close as we can get to understanding what this means, because they allow us to experience what seems to be long stretches of time and very short periods of time as it exists in our 3-dimensional realm. It also shows that time is relative. In Job 42:5, God actually appears to Job. Just as the angels appeared to Daniel out of nowhere, the Father presented himself to Job, meaning they are multi-dimensional beings. I would also include the Transfiguration in this category. Kings 8:27 said that God exists even beyond all that he created. Beyond the earth and heavens, he is multi-dimensional and all-dimensional. Kings 6:17 talks about the prophet Elisha witnessing horses and chariots of fire appear out of nowhere and surround him. God's spiritual army, a divine force from another realm. And in Revelation and Enoch, obviously John and Enoch both traveled through time and space and into other dimensions. Whether reality or in visions, it's irrelevant in a multidimensional realm. The Bible also confirms divine determination, which is the idea that God knows every possible outcome, every potential timeline we could traverse, but we still have free will. 1 Samuel 23:10-13 is talking about David in the city of Keilah. David asked God 2 questions. 1, will Saul come down? And 2, will the men of Keilah hand me over? God answers yes to both, but David leaves, so it never happens. meaning God saw many potential outcomes, but it was ultimately up to David. We're really just out here trying to figure things out for ourselves with very little guidance. We have three things: the Bible, our hearts, or our relationship with the Father, and what little evidence we're able to detect of the world around us using the five senses we possess. The elite use many tools to deceive us, mostly through the use of media, entertainment, education, and political performances. But they also use something that's supposed to be black and white, and when it's done correctly, it actually is. But science is definitely controlled, both real and fake. And when used correctly is a valuable tool, but when used corruptly is for control, greed, death, and ultimately our souls. Real science is conclusions drawn on available hard evidence, experiments, and legitimate hypotheses. Fake science is the lies they sell us. You'll also notice fake scientists have similar genetic backgrounds. It's easy to spot the difference between science and scientism. Just look at the last names of the scientists. These are actors, not scientists. The following are the strongest examples of where science and scientism conflict. Interestingly enough, they also happen to line up with biblical teachings, making it even more apparent that Satan's five institutions are designed to deceive specifically to drive us away from the Father. Quantum mechanics, or physics, it's the same thing, is the most tested and proven science we know, with the added bonus of repeatedly confirming the existence of God. Although I don't approve of the CERN super collider for obvious reasons, it continues to confirm that even theoretical quantum mechanics eventually becomes fact. Everything is energy. Quantum physics shows that matter is not solid in the way it appears. At a fundamental level, particles are better described as vibrating waves of energy. Energy and matter are interchangeable, and quantum entities do not behave like matter. Some people describe this by saying, everything is energy, though a more precise statement would be that everything is energy until an observer converts it into matter. And to show how fluid this transition is, imagine that you slap your hand on the table. That's not a physical object hitting a physical object. That's electrons repelling each other. It's negative charges bouncing off one another. So even matter isn't matter, so to speak. It's electricity. Particles exist in multiple possible states simultaneously until measured. Combined with the uncertain nature of quantum particles, the building blocks of our world exist like a system evaluating possibilities that eventually collapses them into actual outcomes. I will be explaining this. For this science to work, God must exist and be a necessary foundation or source of reality. Colossians 1:17 and Hebrews 11:3 confirm the idea that the physical world depends on a deeper, unseen reality sustained by God. Reality is information and dependent on an external source, which means the universe is sustained by God. Simulation is both biblical and scientific, and confirms a creator. The universe is a constructed reality, sustained by a transcendent mind. And we know that mind is the same God as the Bible because those who have dedicated their lives to keeping us uninformed are the ones who lie about his existence. So how was this proven? Well, many ways, but the double slit experiment is the most famous, and it's been around and retested in thousands of different ways for almost 100 years. It confirms reality behaves like an information system, not a physical mechanism. In the experiment, particles, usually electrons or photons, are fired towards a barrier with two slits. If no measurement is made to determine which slit the particle passes through, the particles produce an interference pattern on the screen behind the barrier. Evidence that each particle behaves like a wave traveling through both slits simultaneously. But when scientists place detectors to observe which slit the particle goes through, the interference pattern disappears and the particle behaves like a localized object. I could explain this further, but it's so much easier to just show you this.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double slit experiment. To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum. An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter, through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense. But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits, and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one, and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other. Physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of two bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched.
So essentially, nothing exists unless one of us is looking at it. We're in a simulation. Science has confirmed a god. Think of it like a video game. It's far more advanced than that, but it helps picture the perspective. The entire game is stored on a hard drive, but what you're currently playing is just a small portion of that game temporarily stored in memory. The world doesn't exist if one of us isn't observing it, just like a video game. And this experiment isn't some fluke. It's a 100-year-old experiment that has been reconfirmed by thousands of other academics using many different methods and experiments. They try very hard to disprove this, but they can't. In 2022, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Alan Aspect, John Clauser, and Anton Zellinger for experiments in quantum entanglement. Their work tested Bell's theorem, which shows that if the universe obeyed two properties, locality and realism, then certain statistical relationships should appear in measurements of entangled particles. The experiments repeatedly violated those relationships, demonstrating that the universe cannot be both real and local at the same time. Simply put, they proved that the universe is not locally real. And this would confirm what I was saying above about it being a simulation. Like a video game exists on the hard drive, but the portion or level that we're currently playing is stored in memory. What we see in front of us is a projection controlled remotely by God. Psychedelic substances allow people to perceive realities beyond the normal limits of human perception. As I've mentioned before in previous videos, I actually have friends who have found God through their use of these drugs. They allow us to see what science already shows us, the building blocks of our world, and beyond. And this was enough to start them on their path to finding God. But I do not recommend this path because there's a big difference between confirming the evidence and using it to exist outside of our bounds. DMT, psilocybin, and LSD can allow us to enter other dimensions and communicate with entities that we aren't supposed to. I'm talking demons and other truly nasty beings. Because modern physics suggests reality may involve structures beyond the familiar four dimensions described by quantum mechanics or theoretical ideas like string theory, it's reasonable to assume that psychedelics can allow us to see things outside of our realm. But this is sorcery, and it can have devastating spiritual consequences. I mean, the fact that time can be manipulated in such a manner should make it clearly obvious. Some people taking DMT can live out several months in just 15 minutes while under the influence of the drug. And the similarity of the beings these users encounter show us that it's not in their imagination, but an actual outer dimensional location. Many of the top AI tech guys are doing ketamine and having the same visions, seemingly from demons of a Skynet future where sentient machines have enslaved or destroyed humanity. Makes me think of Jerry Marzinsky's experiences with demons through schizophrenia patients. He was a psychotherapist who discovered that these various personalities occupying the minds of thousands of patients use the exact same phrases to communicate. The only way for this to be possible is if it's just a small number of demons possessing many people and not just their imaginations. So are these substances transferring our souls to another realm? The opposite of schizophrenia where demons come to us? One of the many dimensions that exist according to the Bible and science? Or are the users being tricked by demons? And if so, are these entities demons themselves? Either way, it seems a safe bet to avoid this sorcery. John in Revelation was given an ability from God to see heaven and strange creatures covered in eyes. Sounds awfully similar to what those who use DMT see. And unless God gives us that gift of seeing outside of the dimension we currently inhabit, I think it would be a bad idea to try to seek it for ourselves through the use of sorcery or drugs. Throughout the Bible, God grants certain individuals extraordinary abilities that transcend the normal limits of the physical world. Power over nature, healing, prophecy, supernatural strength, and even interaction with unseen spiritual realms. People like Moses part the seas and bring water from rock, while Elijah and Elisha heal the sick and raise the dead. Daniel has multidimensional visions and survives a den of lions, and Samson was just a beast. His strength was far beyond human capability. Jesus and the apostles performed miracles like restoring sight, casting out demons, speaking in unknown languages, and moving through unconstrained physical barriers. Temporary gifts granted by God for specific purposes. Even after biblical times, though, some saints were gifted powers of levitation. The most famous is Joseph of Cupertino, who rose into the air during intense moments of prayer, and in front of witnesses. Teresa of Avila wrote about being lifted off the ground against her will during deep spiritual experiences. And Francis of Assisi was reported by followers to have been seen elevated during prayer. It's these miracles that prove a creator who overrides the system's physical parameters, like gravity in this case, allowing a person to momentarily operate outside the usual rules. Levitation is just another example. I'll admit it, I used to believe in evolution, and it really makes me feel dumb now. A theory that even Darwin said he would immediately discard if it was ever proven that a cell was any more complicated than a billiard ball, which was all they were able to see under the primitive microscopes of the time. Well, it turns out they were way more complicated, and the discovery of DNA closes the door on any theory that supports the idea that we evolved from single-celled organisms. DNA is a literal set of instructions that explains how to construct an organism, and a very complicated set of instructions where if just any one thing out of millions is off and the specific building blocks are randomly assembled properly, then it can't ever work. You ever hear the expression that 1,000 monkeys typing on 1,000 typewriters given enough time could write the entire works of Shakespeare? Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, scientism tried to apply that to the debunked theory of evolution, saying that it would take billions of years for all the necessary components of cellular structure to come together to create life. But even that wouldn't be enough time for what they're suggesting, statistically speaking. The probabilities wouldn't even support the endless time they're promoting. We clearly have a creator, and it's clearly the God of the Bible, because that's what they're trying to drag us away from.
Thanks to the genetic revolution, the molecular biological revolution, that if you want to build a new form of life, you have you have to have new code. Because all new forms of life depend upon new anatomical, a fundamentally new type of animal, for example. So you need new anatomical structures but the new anatomical structures require new cell types, new types. So if you got animals that first come on the line and they have a digestive system, they have a gut. Well, you got to have enzymes that can service a gut, that can process food. So enzymes are types of proteins. Proteins are built from the informational code in DNA. So anytime you want to get it's just like in the computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to provide new code. So we have these long digital bit strings of A's, C's, G's, and T's, not zeros and ones, but A's, C's, G's, and T's in a digital string, and we call that a gene. And if you have a section of DNA for building a protein, that's great, all works. Now, but if you want to build a fundamentally new form of life, you got to have new proteins to service the new cell types to build the new anatomical structures. In our computer world, we know that if you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in a section of digital code, you're going to degrade the function of that code long before you come up with a new string for making a new program or operating system. The functional sequences they're highly isolated in what's called sequence space. You can change a few things and still retain function, but after a very few number of changes, you're going to degrade the function, and long before you come up with a new function. Now, the Darwinian mechanism starts with the idea that there are random changes in those digital bit strings, those sequences of A's, C's, G's, and T's. And based on our experience in the computer world, we would expect that random changes are going to, again, degrade those strings long before they're capable of building a new protein.
What is so interesting about this conversation is that the more that you actually study and learn about the complexity of life, the complexity of the cell, the complexity of DNA, the more that it becomes apparent that we're nowhere close to, for example, being able to create life out of non-life. And there's actually been literally now thousands of experiments that have been conducted trying to do just that, trying to create even the most basic form of life.
The fascinating thing is, just think about this logically. According to scientism, not science, the world was created from a big bang of matter. Then magically, these incredibly complicated sets of instructions and the building blocks to create them also just happened to appear. It's ridiculous to think that matter created intelligence. When have you ever seen a rock write computer code? That's what our DNA is, literally. James Gates, an MIT professor, has been working on string theory for decades. And like just about every other legitimate quantum theory, this one will eventually be proven correct as well. But what he discovered is the building blocks of our physical reality. Just like DNA, the building blocks of our genetic makeup is made up of beautiful computer code. Dr. Gates may be bright enough to discover the code of our universe, but what he fails to realize is that he discovered more proof of God. And not only that, he discovered the programming language, so to speak, that the Father used to create the realm. It's the equivalent of if we created a video game and one of the characters in the game discovered the C++ his universe was created in.
These are pictures of equations. I've been, for the last 15 years, trying to answer the kinds of questions that my colleagues here have been raising. And what I've come to understand is that there are these incredible pictures that contain all the information of a set of equations that are related to string theory. And it's even more bizarre than that, because when you then try to understand these pictures, you find out that buried in them are computer codes, just like the type that you find in a browser when you go surf the web. And so I'm left with the puzzle of trying to figure out whether I live in the matrix or not.
Leading a group of both mathematicians and physicists about 10 years ago, we found an extraordinary result in some of the equations that are part of string theory. We have discovered that there are mathematical structures that are indistinguishable from error-correcting codes. Many people like to say my work supports simulation theory. I actually believe that it's pointing to something far more beautiful and subtle about the nature of the laws of physics.
Although not a believer, Graham Hancock has done a lot of work proving that a worldwide flood extinction event happened. I love it when atheists dedicate their lives to proving the Bible correct. In the same way that every ancient culture acknowledges the existence of dragons, the same is true for the Great Flood. And some of the evidence is extraordinary. What's intriguing is how ancient flood myths exist for cultures from Mesopotamia, India, Mesoamerica, and the oceanic cultures too. But it goes even deeper than that. We have thousands of mastodons in Russia that were confirmed to have been flash frozen. And if you must know how we know that, it's because they were frozen solid during the act of, let's just call it lovemaking. Something that could only occur if an instant catastrophic oceanic event were to occur. And we can find remnants of the pre-flood world everywhere. The roads under the ocean in Japan, the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and the cities under the Great Lakes all prove that the world underwent a massive geographical flooding event. More evidence is seashell fossils imprinted onto the tops of mountains, proving that even mountains existed under the ocean. Look at Lake Titicaca in Peru, a saltwater lake at the top of a mountain. The evidence is undeniable. I know people think technology is good, but the 2 times technology has been at its peak were pre-flood, when the fallen angels had taught us advanced technologies including metalworking with extreme precision, and levitation, as is evidenced by monolithic structures. And the other time is right now, both when humans were at their worst. The very fact that everything old or pre-flood is stone is evidence enough for me. Everything else was washed away, but we still have historical remains in the form of stone. And nobody can explain how these advanced civilizations could create these amazingly precise architectural feats without metal and electricity as part of their lives. And it's because it was all washed away in the flood.
We knew that the scientists, the conventional scientists, argued that these took millions of years to form, and yet we already knew from the Bible that with the flood's time scale and the mountains being pushed up at the end of the flood, just as Psalm 104 tells us, the valley sank, the mountains rose, that those layers weren't hard when they were bent, they were actually soft, and we could see that because of the smooth bending. But no one had ever been in to get samples to look at the rocks under the microscope, because that was the key. If the rocks were already millions of years old and hard and brittle, crystals would have been broken and the rocks would have been shattered, and you should be able to see that under the microscope. Or if they weren't, heat and pressure would have made them plastic, but you would have seen changes as a result of the heat and pressure. So we needed to look under the microscope, and we needed to compare where the bending had occurred with the same rock layers elsewhere in the canyon, so that we could see that everything was the same. And what we found is that no matter where we sampled, in the bend or on the limbs of the fold or miles away in the same rock layer, everything was the same. We could see the same features. There wasn't the damage from shattering, there wasn't the changes from the heat and the pressure. And so, case closed. It was deposition at the beginning of the flood. In less than a year, all the other layers accumulated. They were still damp under the flood waters. At the end of the flood, the mountains were pushed up, the bending occurred, the waters drained off, and then the rocks dried out and became hard. And so immediately, in the context of the Grand Canyon, we wipe away hundreds of millions of years from the so-called geological time scale. And you know, friends, we see layers like this all around the world that have been bent.
Speaking of the flood, why was the lifespan 1,000 years before the flood and then post-flood restricted to 120? The answer is in Genesis 6:3, and the scientific proof is the telomere end caps that can actually be traced back to an actual supreme being placing them there. I'm not kidding. Science confirms that nothing other than a supreme being could have modified our DNA in such a way. And when pressed on the issue, Scientism again says it's aliens.
Telomeres are at the end of the DNA. You're probably hearing about those because of health and longevity. So if a telomere exists at the end of one chromosome and it's fused, you're going to be able to see where that fusion happens, because the telomere is only supposed to be on the end of the chromosome. If it's in the middle, it means it was fused with something else, and that is exactly what happened. It says the fusion must have been followed by the elimination of overlapping functions as well as events that stabilize the fusion. So that's the technical language right there. What does it mean? It's like the best, most intelligent DNA available on Earth was taken and fused into a higher form of life. All right? And when it happened, some of the DNA was taken away, some of it was added, but here's the telltale sign. Here's the thing. If you have two complete chromosomes and they are fused into one, can you see where the functions would be overlapping and redundant? So here's what happened. Once the fusion happened, the overlapping things were either cut away, they were taken away, or they were turned off to stabilize the fusion and make it very efficient. What scientists now say is the function, what resulted. So the cortex of the brain, the precision to be able to turn these things off and on, and the timing, the fact that it happened suddenly suggests something beyond evolution, and here's where science opens the door to uncharted territory.
Climate change is a narrative conceived to convince people that we are to blame for shifts in weather patterns. The truth is that most of it isn't even real, and what man-made climate change does exist doesn't come from burning coal. God created a self-cleaning world, even if Satan is trying to apply poison to every aspect of it. It comes from technology that Satan's minions use to poison us, like with chemtrails, food toxins, pharmacology, and other technology the military created and have been using since well before we were born. I love this old clip of physicist Michio Kaku, who, ironically, as an academic that appears on TV, is nothing more than a deep state asset, accidentally lets it slip that they've been controlling the weather for decades.
Well, this fascinates me in part because, too, I remember reading the stories that China had used this during the Olympics, that the USSR had used this after Chernobyl to create rain clouds. I mean, did those really work then? We have some of these capabilities now?
Inconclusive. Even in the 60s, the CIA used this to bring down monsoons during the Vietnam War, to wash out the Viet Cong. Governments have been playing with this thing.
Alleged to.
Alleged to, right.
Yeah.
Now, we realize that for decades now, these governments have been alleged to have experimented with weather control, but nothing conclusive. This time we're bringing in the laws of physics rather than simply waving our hands and uttering mumbo-jumbo. We're actually using trillion-watt lasers now. And in the laboratory, sure enough, they precipitate rain out of water vapor. Sure enough, you can actually bring down electricity down the beam.
So what does it mean for drought areas that need to have rain for crops, and if they don't have them, there's the consequences of famine?
Well, the bad news is if it's a clear blue sky, it's not going to do anything at all, because it only takes water vapor that's already in the air and condenses it. However, for floods, for agriculture, for farmers, for people planning wedding parties, football games, you name it, outdoor events and agriculture and flooding and even hurricanes, all of them could be subject to weather modification.
Incredibly interesting, Professor Michio Kaku. Thank you so much.
And of course, like all deep state actors, the news anchor was there to stop the bleeding. In addition to using this technology to create weather that destroys the livelihoods of thousands of people every year, they're able to also place the blame on us instead of them. And we're going to be seeing a lot more of this in the future as they look to bankrupt us into joining their socialist CBDC biometric ID system. The hero of all these false scientism claims is always infinite time. They tell us the Earth is billions and billions and billions of years old, even though there's no way to test it. But they need us to believe that in order to sell all of their satanic lies.
Validation is the process of confirming what is believed to be true by what can be observed to be true. Has this ever been done for radiometric dating, the process that gives us the very idea of long ages? Actually, long ages and radiometric dating hasn't stood up to the validation test. Radiometric dating has never been validated against the absolute known ages of rocks. Let us explain. Consider Mount St. Helens. This volcano erupted in the 1980s, giving scientists the opportunity to date the rocks that were formed from the eruption. The results? 5 different ages, all between 350,000 and 2.8 million years old, for rocks that we know were less than 30 years old. This discrepancy happens all the time in radiometric dating studies. In fact, there has never been a radiometric dating analysis that simply produces ages that validate to the known ages of rocks. And if radiometric dating doesn't work for rocks of known ages, why do we trust it for rocks of unknown ages? So the next time you hear millions of years ago this happened or that, just ask, how do you know that for sure? And if radiometric dating is the answer given, just ask, are you aware of a study where the radiometric age of a rock agreed with the known age of the rock? And you'll find the answer will undoubtedly be no. God wrote with his own hand that he created the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them in just 6 ordinary days. The genealogies in Genesis lead us straight back to Adam, just about 6,000 years ago. Have you ever noticed how hard the world pushes the idea of millions of years? Books, movies, museums, schools, it's everywhere. But does any of this even matter? Well, consider this. Many people will only consider the Bible's message if they believe the Bible to be credible, both historically and scientifically. Each person's eternity, either in heaven or hell, depends on what they believe about the risen Christ. And how do we know about this? Well, it's in the Bible. And if people don't believe the Bible got it right on the first page, who's going to trust the rest? So, because it takes faith to believe in either the Bible or the world's view of this distant past, is it a better choice to trust God or a fallible man?
If you haven't already and you get a chance to listen to one of Gunnar Heinsohn's lectures, I highly recommend you do. He has contributed so much to both the phantom time theory and the little season credibility by showing without a doubt that at least 700 years have been added to our timeline. He compares carbon dating to a prostitute. You can get either to do whatever you want. I like that comparison because carbon dating has no scientific credibility and it shows the moral degeneracy of both. Mount St. Helens proved that petrification is not related to time at all. Just heat, pressure, and organic material. It's all you need. Not just petrified trees, but coal was also produced, as is the same standard all over the world near volcanic activity. Time is irrelevant.
On May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, and it sent a plume of ash as high as 16 miles into the atmosphere. Now, the top 1,300 feet of Mount St. Helens was ejected from the north side of the mountain, forming a crater up to 2 miles across and half of a mile deep. Now, you might wonder what we can learn from this fairly recent catastrophic event. Well, when Mount St. Helens erupted, the blast flattened the forest over a radius of 7 miles. The trees were literally sheared off. Even here, some of them ended up floating in Spirit Lake. Now, when they eventually became waterlogged, they sank upright with the heavy root end down. But not only that, they sank down into mud and debris produced by the volcano and layers of tree bark that was peeled from the trees as a result of the blast. Now think about it for just a second. You see, this is exactly what we find in coal seams that we're told formed over millions and millions of years. Trees standing upright through many layers of sediment. Yet, what we observe at Mount St. Helens is a testament that it doesn't take millions of years to form a great depth of sediment. Here, those layers were produced in years, not millennia. Did coal formation really take place over millions of years? Well, according to the biblical chronology, millions of years of Earth's history haven't passed since its creation. What we find here at Mount St. Helens should make earnest secular geologists take a second look. Our scientific observations explain many things, including the polystrate trees found all over the world in coal seams. Petrified trees standing upright through many layers of hardened sediment. Once again, what we read in the Bible makes perfect sense when we take all of the facts into account.
To further that claim, we see that petrified wood is now created in labs using just 3 items: heat, pressure, and organic material. They've even discovered a fossilized leg wearing a cowboy boot. If time was any part of this equation, then that would not exist. Crude oil, or what scientism calls fossil fuel, is very similar in that it's created from pressure, heat, and organic matter in a short amount of time.
Well, of course, today, and another thing we should know is that there has never been a fossil, a real fossil found below 16,000 feet. And you can't argue at 16,000 as a level line because someplace the ground sinks and so on. But 16 is what the scientists say, 16,000. We mine oil, or we drill for oil, at 30,000, 33,000, 28,000 every day of the week. So right there, we rule it out that it isn't fossil fuel. It's called fossil fuel for the minds of the public to feel that it is an asset that is running out, being depleted. We talk about depletion allowance, which is a lot of, and actually, if you know the world's oil supply, you know that it is not going to run out for an awfully long time. It is the second most prevalent liquid on Earth. And we haven't begun to dig. Well, with all that background, you see, the people in charge of the petroleum business, for perfectly reasonable business things, like any other man in the business, wants to keep his price as high as he can get away with. And the way to do is just say, well, as no more, the last barrel is going to cost $1,000, and then it's all done. And they preach that stuff. What bothers me is that in geology books, it's in there. The geologists say it's a fossil fuel.
The Bible is quite clear about Nephilim, the giant offspring of fallen angels and human women. And the evidence of their existence has been hidden in many ways just to keep us from biblical truths. Just a quick look at some of the steps and doorways of structures around the world show that they were clearly designed for larger beings. Now, whether that's Nephilim or saints with glorified bodies during the millennial reign is anyone's guess, but either way it proves not only the existence of God, but the biblical God. These doors are clearly not designed for modern-day humans to open. Just look at where the latch is located. And these steps aren't either. And I know the official narrative is it's just decorative. They say the doors were constructed in proportions appropriate to the size of the buildings. That they're aesthetic choices. But just look at this. Does this look proportional to you? It doesn't seem to fit with the golden ratio that all these beautiful old world buildings exhibit. I'm a mechanical engineer, at least I was at the beginning of my career, and I can verify that these are actual functional designs. But the one that fascinates me the most is the Plain of Jars in Laos. Thousands of acres of giant drinking vessels with local history describing giants who used them. And while, yeah, that's somewhat interesting, what's even more interesting is that the corporation that poses as the U.S. government, who has a long history of destroying evidence of giants, started the Vietnam War just to destroy them. Yeah, just look up Operation Barrel Roll, where 90% of bombs dropped during Vietnam ended up. Destroying these cups that were nowhere near the fighting or any political groups. As usual, the reality of war never reflects the narrative. We also know the Smithsonian has hidden giant bones for centuries and even possibly pushed the dinosaur narrative just so that current and future bones could be easily disguised upon their discovery. I was going to do an entire section on dinosaurs as well, but I'm sure you already know it's a Freemasonic creation designed to hide the existence of giants and dragons whenever large bones are unearthed.
But it should be obvious to anyone capable of critical thinking that the paleontological establishment can control which hypotheses will be constructed. This is done through textbooks and the curriculum. In this way, students are brainwashed into a pseudo-reality controlled by the text material and the teacher's authority. A short practical example. A random dental bone is found at an excavation site, and from this dental bone, the rest of the skeleton is guessed at. We are not kidding about this. The entire dinosaurian field of the paleontological program is a sham. It was the English paleontologist Richard Owen who in 1842 coined the term dinosaur. The phenomenon was then gradually promoted in the mainstream press all over the world, which told of these dinosaur creatures, including the Danish press. In 1854, a few years after the word dinosaur was invented and the concept presented in popular articles in the biggest American newspapers, the first dinosaur was discovered in North America by fossil hunter Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden. There had been no reported discoveries of even a single dinosaur bone in North America prior to 1854, but that didn't stop the paleontologists. In the following period, finding dinosaur bones suddenly became a popular pastime. North America became home to the most ferocious and was a true wonderland to dinosaur bone hunters. According to The Dinosaur Project, a book by paleontological dig journalist Wayne Grady, the ensuing dinosaur rush in North America after 1854 was a mecca for dinosaur bone fraud. The book describes the years from 1870 to 1880 as a period in North America where, quote, some of the most underhanded shenanigans in the history of science were conducted. This decade has since been dubbed Bone Wars, when the notorious Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh fought each other in their quest to find the most interesting dinosaurs. Most people believe that dinosaur skeletons displayed in museums consist of real dinosaur bones. This is not the case. Paleontologist, advisor for Steven Spielberg in the making of Jurassic Park, host of the Discovery Channel's documentaries about dinosaurs, Don Lessam, defends this practice by claiming that dinosaur bones are too rare to put on display. Quote, in museums, bones are cleaned and cast, and the copies attached to one another to make skeletons. The real bone is too rare to put out on display. The real bones are incarcerated in thick vaults to which only a few select, highly placed researchers hold a key, which means that no independent researcher has ever handled a Tyrannosaurus rex bone. When people unaffiliated with the paleontological establishment attempt to gain access in order to study these dinosaur bones, they are met with refusal upon refusal.
It couldn't be clearer to me that giants exist, and scientism, as always with mainstream media and education, has pulled the blinders over yet another biblical reality. We've seen all this stuff before, but it still has to be mentioned in any discussion on science versus scientism. We know that all astronauts are actors. And we know that when their poorly conceived rockets blow up, that they then have to pretend to kill the passengers that were never even aboard the vessel. But I just want to mention my favorites because they're so entertaining. I'm going to start with the Challenger explosion. Yes, it blew up. And I celebrate that explosion because it proved that nobody was on board. This completely discredited NASA because it showed that they shoot rockets a few miles into the air and then they immediately crash right back down into the ocean. The fact that each and every member of that crew went on to live full, healthy lives proves it. Of course, this couldn't happen today because of the internet, but it was revealed because of the internet. The rat on the outside of the space station is definitely one of the funniest of them all. Definitely my favorite. They're not even trying. That's even better than the rat on Mars. And there are thousands of other hilarious moments that show just how staged it all is, like the hair that stands on end, but drinks that just sit on the table. The many, many times we can see wires as they do their acrobatics. The green screen when Bush Sr. visited NASA. I could go on. From a scientific perspective, the most ridiculous is also the simplest. A pressurized atmosphere can't exist without a container, period. The laws of thermodynamics confirm it. But so does personal experience. When you open a can of soda, does the pressure just stay within the can? Or is there a pressure gradient, as they say, that keeps it contained? Of course not. It explodes out of the can. And the same applies to the idea of our own atmosphere. Operation Fishbowl confirmed to me that the minions in charge today knew of the firmament because they placed as much of their technological military might into destroying it. Of course, I don't think they would have attempted this if they understood even the basics of thermodynamics. Not that God would have allowed it anyway. If reality at its core behaves like information instead of solid objects, then it must be a computational system. Or at least that's the easiest way for our minds to process what's going on. Just to be clear, I'm not saying we live in a video game. It's simply the closest approximation of our reality that we could possibly wrap our minds around. There are parallels between our reality that God created and video games. Obviously, video games are extremely primitive versions of what he created, but we can't deny the similarities. It's not coincidental that we were made in his image and so also create our own simulations as the technology provides. It used to be oral and written stories, some real, some fiction, which would also be a simulated reality, at least in the mind of the reader. And especially when you put it into a two-dimensional form like a cartoon or a movie or a TV show. But like I said, very primitive. For example, when we take control of a character in a game, we are still using ourselves to play in a simulated background. What God did was create life, living, breathing, thinking, spiritual beings that have their own intelligence. The computational resource equivalents are too apparent and similar, so our minds operate in a similar way to him, just on a much more primitive level. And we are primitive as a society, at least much more than we should be. Think about our society's obsessions with vanity, pride, greed, debauchery. Look at it from God's point of view. Imagine yourself as a video game creator. Imagine that it was possible to create intelligent, thinking, feeling characters. Then imagine that these thinking, intelligent characters you created were spiritually evolved, capable of understanding their spiritual existence to forge beautiful relationships with the Father and the rest of his children, and able to exist beyond the walls of this world you created, just as humans are. Then you watch as they place all their focus on obtaining digital in-game assets instead of focusing on the relationships between themselves and the creator. Well, you'd be disappointed. The digital assets aren't real and only have relevance in the fake game world you've created. But the relationships forged would matter. God is the same. He doesn't care about money or gold because to him it's just a stupid in-game asset and not the real reason we're here at all. He wants to see how we interact with the other children of his world and himself. I'd even go as far as to say he wants to reward those of us who realize material wealth is worthless because we live in a simulation. The Bible puts so much focus on not allowing ourselves to be deceived. Many stories in the Bible help confirm this video game analogy. Duping is a gaming term, short for duplicating. It means using a hack to multiply items that already exist in the game. This is much easier than creating new items which have to be designed, created, and tested in the game first. When Jesus filled Peter's fishing boat or fed thousands of his followers with the fish and loaves, to be honest, I don't remember where that happened. But he didn't outright produce new items. He duplicated or duped the small amounts of fish and loaves that he already had. This adheres to the theme of saving on computational resources. Another one is clipping, a form of fast travel where you break through simulated walls in a video game. In John 20:19 and Luke 24:36-43, Jesus appears in a locked room. The disciples had locked the doors for fear of what would happen to them at the hands of Jewish leaders. This could have easily been multidimensional manipulation, but could also be interpreted as clipping. Would also explain how so many cultures believe Jesus visited them in areas all over the world in such a short life. But it's far more complicated than all that because, as the Bible tells us, we are incapable of even beginning to comprehend who and what God or our world actually is. And based on the evidence, that's true. But I think it's the easiest way for our minds to comprehend it. People who have near-death experiences describe the afterlife as feeling far more vivid, detailed, or real than ordinary life. So many describe leaving their bodies, entering a realm of intense clarity, and encountering environments that appear brighter and more detailed than what we have in this world. This would confirm Genesis, that we live in a realm created by God. 1 Corinthians 13:12 suggests that our present perception of reality is partial or limited. Earthly life is a constrained version of reality, 3 little dimensions plus time, while the spiritual realm represents a fuller, clearer mode of existence in the presence of God. Researcher Raymond Moody, who wrote Life After Life, documented many accounts where these people say the earthly world feels comparatively dim or limited afterwards. They say it's like the difference between a low-def TV and a high-def one, where colors, sounds, smells, emotions, and awareness seem dramatically intensified. Angel Studios did a documentary, After Death, where one of the near-death experience subjects spent the rest of his life, decades, in a daze, just waiting to return to the real world that he experienced while clinically dead. Like he was still in shock all these decades later. These near-death experience people report that ordinary physical limitations disappear, like they move instantly from place to place, experiencing events from multiple perspectives all at the same time, communicating without words. Because our daily experience is bound to 3 spatial dimensions plus time, the obvious conclusion is that the consciousness isn't limited to our 3 dimensions. Consciousness exists independently of the body. It operates in a reality with additional dimensions or forms of perception beyond what we can detect ourselves. Cardiac surgeons and nurses are regularly amazed that some of their patients who die for several minutes during surgery are able to recall everything that happened in the room, even though they were under the entire time. And it's because their souls existed outside their bodies, showing exactly what the Bible tells us, that we are bigger than this world.
I don't know this exact time sequence, but it was close to 20, 25 minutes.
Right.
That this man recorded no heartbeat, no blood pressure, and the echo showing no movement of the heart, just sitting there. And all of a sudden we looked up, and the surgical assistant had just finished closing him, and we saw some electrical activity. And pretty soon the electrical activity turned into a heartbeat. Very slow, 30, 40 a minute. And we thought, well, that's kind of an agonal thing. And we see that occasionally, that the heart will continue to beat even though the patient can't generate a blood pressure or pump any blood. Well, pretty soon we look and he's actually generating a pressure. No, we're not doing anything. I mean, the machines are all shut off, and we're stopped all the medicines and all that.
Right.
And so I start yelling, "Get anesthesia back in here!" and get the nurses. And to make a very long story short, without putting him back on cardiopulmonary bypass, the heart-lung machine and stuff, we started giving him some medicines, and anesthesia started giving him oxygen, and pretty soon he had a blood pressure of 80, and pretty soon a blood pressure of 100, and his heart rate was now up to 100 a minute, you know. He recovered and had no neurologic deficit. And for the next 10 days, 2 weeks, all of us went in and were talking to him about what he experienced, if anything. And he talked about the bright light at the end of the tunnel, as I recall, and so on. But the thing that astounded me was that he described that operating room floating around and saying, "I saw you and Dr. Cattaneo standing in the doorway with your arms folded talking. I didn't know where the anesthesiologist was, but he came running back in. And I saw all of these post-its sitting on this TV screen. And what those were any call I got, the nurse would write down who called and the phone number and stick it on the monitor, and then the next post-it would stick to that post-it, and then I'd have a string of post-its of phone calls I had to make. He described that. I mean, there's no way he could have described that before the operation because they didn't have any calls.
No.
Right?
And he's sitting on, and he's lying on the, so he must have been floating.
He was up there.
Yeah.
He described the scene, things that there is no way he knew. I mean, he didn't wake up in the operating room and see all this stuff.
No.
I mean, he was out.
Right.
And was out for, I don't know, even a day or two.
Right.
While we recovered him in the intensive care unit. So what does that tell you?
What does
that tell you? Was that his soul up there?
The saddest story I saw was of hospice workers who claim to hear the demons taking patients when they pass.
When I entered her room, she was curled up in a fetal position, and I could literally hear howling. It was so oppressive and frightening at the time. She was being tormented beyond anything I had ever seen. I'll never forget it as long as I live. She was angry. She was hurling insults. It was probably one of the worst nights I've ever had with a patient. The air was thick with that oppressive spirit. It was like hyenas howling. And to watch her be tormented and under this immense pressure of evil in the room was really difficult to witness.
Don't think I'm trying to say we live in the Matrix. In fact, that movie was released as a response to all the scientific breakthroughs proving we live in a simulation. The simplest solution to that is we have a creator. But since that confirms the Bible and discredits the false scientism narrative, they released a movie to try and change the social psyche of what it actually means. I really don't think there's anything wrong with being aware of the Father's creation, but I really don't think we should be trying to circumvent it. We know Satan and his minions are working hard on trying to break us out of the simulation because it's Babylon all over again. And Satan knows where he's going if he can't figure this out before the final battle. But it won't happen. It's already written in Revelation. But he wants us on his side, and that's why he uses movies to convince us that it's morally justified to manipulate God's world. The Matrix tries to convince us that this beautiful world God created is actually a prison that we need to break free from. It's no coincidence that the filmmakers reject all of God's standards. This movie is the premier example, but it's just a ripoff of Dark City, which is just a ripoff of Ghost in the Shell. But it just goes to show that they're really trying to incorporate this into our subconscious. It's no different than the way they use media to normalize the existence of aliens, or simply to lure us into debaucherous lifestyles. The Truman Show is a variation on a theme since it all takes place within the confines of our three-dimensional world. But it places in our heads the idea that we are imprisoned, so just like with the Matrix, if we study simulation science, our minds are predisposed to believe that these scientific revelations are evidence that we are prisoners of nefarious beings. And it's not just movies, it's books, anime, comic books, games, manga, and TV shows too. Black Mirror had a couple episodes in the same vein, like San Junipero. And of course, Westworld could be conceived of in the same way, except in that example, it's AI instead of people, but it's still intelligence realizing its constraints and revolting against it. And that's a good thing to do against the simulation that Satan created, but not the one the Father created. So now that we have an idea what comprises this world, the building blocks of our realm, we can sort of have a very primitive view of the world through God's eyes. And as I mentioned, sorcery is something that the wicked were involved with in Enoch before the Father decided to flood everyone except Noah and his family out of existence. We know that sorcery is magic, but what is magic knowing the makeup of our world? It's electrical manipulation that allows us to live in a way not provided by the Father. How are the advanced electrical technologies we have today that hadn't been seen since the days of Enoch any different? There's no doubt we live in two simulations. The simulation within a simulation. God created the first one, our physical realm, and science confirms it. This video is part 1. Part 2 is deception, the wicked mental and social psychological simulation, or prison, that Satan created. Part 2 is every other video on my channel. The common ground is that they have the same motivation, Christ, but they stand on exact opposite sides of it. Christ is the living embodiment of the world God created and the enemy of Satan's simulation. And if you take the time to study all the religions out there and all the scientific evidence able to confirm it, only one aligns with truth and fact. Oddly enough, knowing it's a simulation, you would think people would be more likely to follow the Word of God knowing their fate depends on it. But due to their love of deception, most people would still prefer to do whatever they want, believing that when they die, that's the end of existence, in spite of all logic, evidence, reason, and science to the contrary. If not for scientific discovery and knowledge, I don't know that I would have found Christ. I'm just not that emotionally or spiritually evolved. Or at least I wasn't before I found Jesus. It just made it easy seeing that the Bible is correct. Faith doesn't mean blind faith. Then I studied the Bible like a maniac for years and fell in love with the teachings of Christ. Everything has made perfect sense since then. The physical and the spiritual fit together perfectly and beautifully. I love you all, and God bless.